For over a century, the US dollar has relished in its status as the global fiat. But the most recent economic catastrophe and geopolitical involvements have caused the enemies of the US to smell blood. They now realize that the dollar no longer has the greatness that has kept the United States as the world's greatest superpower. How did the dollar lose face before the whole world? And who will step up to fill the power vacuum? Keep watching to find out. Some weeks ago, the Federal Reserve increased the interest rate by 25 points. This would be the latest in a long series of gradual increases, stretching back several months of pain that have claimed many American banks. Dollar printing has been nothing short of outrageous. These have caused other nations to grow wary of the US dollar. With a mounting debt profile of over $31 trillion and a depleting oil reserve, it's clear to the world that the largest economy is crashing headfirst into its impending doom. And her enemies are waiting. Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, is a member of a coalition of several nation-states that have been blanketed as, quote, emerging economies. These include Brazil, Russia, India, and South Africa. Russia is hardly an emerging economy, although it has half the UK's GDP with 3 times its population. Brazil and India are more like it, although they've both experienced stagnated growth in recent years, while South Africa, let's face it, South Africa is basically there for regional representation. But China has a GDP that is more than twice the rest of BRICS put together. So the more accurate question would be, what are Xi Jinping's plans for taking over the world? Global economic power has undergone an astonishing restructuring over the past 20 years, and recent reports indicate that Egypt, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey are either considering joining the BRICS or have already applied to do so. What do they all have in common? They are mostly non-democratic. What are the BRICS and why do they matter? The startling rise of China plays a significant role in the BRICS story. The growth has been so consistent over a very long time that it has really changed the global balance of power. China's GDP is about $18 trillion, compared to Brazil's $1.6 trillion, Russia's $1.8 trillion, India's $3 trillion, and South Africa's $400 billion. More than twice as much as the combined GDP of the other 4 BRICS countries. In terms of purchasing power, China's economy is the biggest in the world. Now, that's one source of attraction. So the reasons why potential BRICS countries want to join are complicated. Consider Saudi Arabia, which is already a very wealthy nation, has close security ties to the United States, and has the ability to mobilize sizable sovereign resources for investment in the direction of economic growth. Yet, its domestic political model is still behind. The economy is heavily dependent on energy, and long-term global decarbonization threatens the economy. But like all authoritarian nations, Saudi Arabia must look for sources of local and global legitimacy. Closer trade ties with China will be essential to this effort, since they will diversify the economy and the sources of external support. Also see Egypt, Iran, and Turkey, where the various regimes have all recently dealt with unstable economies, political unrest, and diplomatic isolation. Remember the Arab Spring. Argentina also. After the devastating financial crisis of 2001, its growth has been erratic, with rising debt and crazy inflation. But the growth of BRICS gives more legitimacy and strengthens people's opinions that the coalition is worthwhile, which could have a snowball effect. The aim of BRICS is to defend themselves against international pressure and lessen dependency on the US dollar and other Western currencies. In fact, Brazil and China have already struck a deal to bypass the dollar when paying for trade goods. A new reserve currency is soon to emerge. So what will this new currency look like, and what will it mean for the dollar? Although the BRICS nations aren't a formal trade bloc, The new currency would initially be used in very large transactions that are government-style transactions between two or more of the countries involved. The US produces 24% of the world's GDP, while the BRICS nations command a combined 25% of the global GDP. But the US dollar is involved in almost 90% of all international trade settlements, and 60% of foreign currency reserves around the world held by central banks are held in US dollars. So it's not surprising that these nations collectively are saying, hey, wait a minute, why should our macroeconomic policies and exchange rates be at the mercy of the US dollar Federal Reserve decision making? Let's take a peek into the future. The German mark was backed by gold until the end of 1914, much like the USD used to be supported by a gold reserve until 1971 under the Nixon administration, when the US completely abandoned the gold standard. The German mark traded at 1 trillion marks to 1 USD after the hyperinflation incident in 1923. Now, the US printed more and more currency in response to the pandemic and other global issues, the same way Germany responded to their World War I war debt. Hyperinflation will happen again, and history will repeat itself with the collapse of the USD in the same manner as the German marks collapsed. In the long term, the United States' gross federal debt to GDP is projected to trend around 138.5% of GDP in 2023 and 139.4% of GDP in 2024, according to econometric models. To remedy this crisis, the Federal Reserve plans to increase interest rates through 2023, another reason Americans are uncomfortable with the debt owed by the federal government. So nations of the world would have to seek alternatives. Countries buying up gold. Last year's buying spree is believed to have been sparked by sanctions imposed on Russia over its invasion of Ukraine. And data shows gold buying by central banks reached its highest level in 55 years, as the freezing of Russia's dollar assets prompted countries to seek alternatives less vulnerable to economic sanctions. China is the standout buyer. The year brought the first reported increase in gold reserves in 3 years, with a total of 62 tons added in November and December. This came as Beijing has taken steps to move away from the dollar, including buying oil in Yuan. Other central banks that made major gold purchases include inflation-hit Turkey with 148 tons, India with 33 tons, Qatar with 35 tons, and Uzbekistan with 34 tons. Russia's gold reserve grew the most in the decade through 2022, more than doubling to 2,298 tons. Venezuela went from just over 10% to more than 80%. Hungary increased its gold holdings by 30-fold to 94 tons in the past decade. In January, Turkey imported gold worth $5.1 billion. The main reasoning behind this is that gold is not directly linked to any economy and thus can withstand turmoil in the global financial markets. The Chinese have, of course, long aspired to develop a digital yuan as an alternative trading currency, and they haven't made a tremendous amount of progress. It's most likely that the Chinese are trying to use the BRICS association as a way to further push the yuan, even though they're saying it doesn't matter if it's a digital rupee or ruble. But in reality, we all know that it would likely be a digital yuan, or at least be heavily based on a digital yuan if it were to come into existence. As the world transitions into a digital age, digital currency will take the USD's place as the global currency, and the USD will lose its position as the world's fiat. That's what happens when all caution is thrown to the wind, like the dollar is in any third world currency. Emerging economies realize that there's a significant risk in it being overly dependent on the US dollar for their reserves and trade settlements. So that's the basis on which we're seeing this BRICS concept emerge right now. Over the past year, Bitcoin has surged in value exponentially. which has generated thousands of speculations about the future of Bitcoin as a global currency. El Salvador. After losing millions of dollars on its high-profile gamble on Bitcoin, El Salvador remains bullish on the flagship cryptocurrency. In 2021, El Salvador became the first nation in the world to approve of Bitcoin as legal tender. As of November 2021, the South American nation had purchased 2,381 Bitcoin. Now that Bitcoin has breached $28,000, the country's holding is worth about $66.7 million. Based on analysis of tweets from El Salvador's president, Nayib Bukele, a Bloomberg calculation in November estimated the government had paid about $105 million for Bitcoin. But, in the long run, digital currencies do have the potential to replace the USD in the future. It is evident that a lack of trust in the USD will hit foreign investment in the United States. This would ultimately be a disaster for the American economy and create a domino effect that would reverberate throughout the world. In order to survive a global currency collapse, it is likely that China will quickly try to establish the Yuan as the world's fiat. Economic paradigm shifts are inevitable as the rules of the game changes. This time will be no different when the US dollar loses its status as the reserve currency. The country that dominates global commerce during any given period is usually marked with the status of having the reserve economy. Spain and Portugal dominated the 15th and 16th centuries, the Netherlands the 17th century, France and Britain the 18th and 19th centuries, and the US dominated the 20th century. Call it an untimely demise, but empires rise and fall. Do you think BRICS would be a force for good in the world? Drop your thoughts below. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more amazing videos. Stay tuned.